Hi there, and welcome to our webinar titled Reimagining Microgrids. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative, and I'm Jeff Postlewaite, Senior Editor for T&D World. Before we get to today's presentation, I just have a couple of housekeeping items on how you can participate with us. So if you have any technical difficulties during the session, please just use the questions window and let us know, and our technical experts will help you out. We do recommend that you disable any pop-up blocking software or VPNs or extensions in your browser because these can cause problems with the webinar player. We love hearing your questions, so please feel free to send as many as you like at any time. You don't need to wait until the presenters are done with their speaking. Just type your questions into the window on the side of the screen and hit submit, and we'll answer as many of those as we can during the Q&A session to follow. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be available soon at the T&D World website, and you will get a link to the archive session in about a week. And feel free to share that when you get it with anyone who you think might get something out of it. So I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have Robert Konzioka, who's the governing body member and vice chair for the California ISO Western Energy Imbalance Market. And we have Mike Beeler, who is national spokesperson for the Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative. Welcome, gentlemen, and I think Mike was going to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. It's great to be with you today, and we are excited to start this new webinar series that's sponsored by the Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative. Last year, we did the cost of underground. This year, we're going to do the cost of underground 2.0. And today's webinar, Reimagined Microgrids, is going to kick that off on a very interesting topic. Rob Konzioka and I have known each other for a long time. We've worked with each other for a long time. And right after the big storm that hit New Orleans, we said, you know what, we're going to write a paper called Critical Infrastructure for Critical Times. And out of that paper came an article that appeared in T&D World magazine in the February issue, and now this webinar. And in that article, that paper and that article and this webinar, we're going to reimagine or redefine what a microgrid is. And if you agree with us, we'd love to hear from you. If you disagree with us, we'd love to hear from you as well. And Jeff told you that you can send in your questions as we go. And I'm going to introduce Rob here in a second, and Rob's going to give just a little bit of his background and then kick it back to me. But get your questions ready for us, and we have got a great day ready for you here and excited to share our thoughts with you and how we want to move the needle in the electric utility industry. So Rob Konzioka, say a greeting to our audience today and give a little bit of your background, if you would.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Konzioka. I've got over 40 years of experience in the electric power industry, worked at multiple utilities, pretty much all on the power side, and almost all of it in the transmission and generation area. Worked in all the different sectors and have a very good flavor for what it takes to operate and manage and plan the system, as well as the budget, as well as where we need to go. So with Mike, I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah, Rob, that's a great intro, and you say you have a very good flavor for it. It's kind of funny. Over the years, I would come up with something that I thought it was new and innovative, and I'd say, hey, Rob, I said, what do you think about this idea? And he goes, yeah, we're doing that. Hey, Rob, next year, what do you think about this idea? Yeah, we're doing that too. So that Rob is a very progressive and innovative thinker, and this industry is always looking for innovation, looking for things that are going to move the needle in the electric utility industry. And Rob and I think that reimagining a microgrid is a great start for that. So for the next 35 minutes or so, Rob's going to present our paper and the article. We're going to have a conversation back and forth. Send your questions in, and we'll see if we can weave them in. But at the end, about the last 20 minutes, we're going to take your questions and really address them. So again, on behalf of the Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative, we really appreciate you listening in today. And Rob Konzioka, if you are ready, tell us about Reimagined Microgrids.
Well, thank you, Mike. So Mike mentioned that we wrote an article for T&D World. It's in the February issue. It's there. There's also a white paper that you can access on the information there. It is the same article, and there's some other information that you might find associated with it of interest. And as we get started, I hope to go through this somewhat quickly so we don't get bogged down into any one particular area. But I'd like to start off noting that the industry really has this novel opportunity to improve electric service during these severe and extreme events to protect communities. And this would be done through new approaches to microgrid before the many billions of dollars that are going to be spent on electric grid resiliency, which I will touch on in a little bit later on. Kind of in an overall capsule, the severe and extreme events are real and they are increasing. I know that there's not always a lot of believers in that, but I'll touch on that briefly. We as an industry need to be planning for these events. I don't believe we are, or at least not widespread consistently. The redefined in microgrids, as we are proposing, can be an integral solution to achieve these high levels of resiliency and high levels of maturity and resiliency. And, the need for action is now. Any solution to achieve any improvements in resiliency takes a long time. And during this time frame, we know that lives and communities and the economies of areas that are hit are at stake. And so it's important that we take action and start moving on this now.
That's a great point, Rob. And you said economies, and I want to focus on that point a lot, on the economies of the communities that have a lack of electric service and what that cost is, we'll say in terms of gross domestic product. And that's something that I don't think as an industry over my career and yours that we've really quantified. So great point. I look forward to hearing more about that.
Okay. And, I'll start off here with this particular slide from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We don't need to go through all these details, but it does note that for the year 2020, there were 22 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the U.S. I'm not sure, about everybody else, but I was really startled to see this type of information and how many bad weather events that we had and how destructive they were. Most of the audience here will remember some other recent notable events just prior to 2020. And in 2018, there was the bomb cyclone that hit the East Coast. There was the 2018 Camp Fire in California that at that time was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history, and it has subsequently been exceeded. 2017, there was Hurricane Harvey that stalled out over Houston and had the massive flooding, had great interruption to the supply chain, if many of you will recall. And then, lastly, in 2017, I think everybody will remember the Hurricane Maria and the devastation that it played on the electric infrastructure in Puerto Rico. It took on the order of a year to get the island back in service. It was, that was, kind of as bad as it gets. Since the article came out, NOAA updated the information here for 2021. And here you'll note a continuing bad trend, and that is there were 20 separate billion-dollar events in 2021. And in that will be some of the more notorious ones. In February, there was that winter storm Uri that impacted Texas and had the rolling blackouts for extended periods of time. That was on the news for, it seems like, forever. And it impacted the economies well outside of Texas. It hit gas prices and electric prices across the entire U.S., not just there. And then, of course, Mike, you mentioned that New Orleans, and of course in August there was Hurricane Ida that leveled the electric system there, and New Orleans was totally blacked out and the surrounding area, and there were extended outages for a long time. And Mike, as you noted, that kind of stirred us into getting something down in writing on how we can address these things better. And then
Rob,
I'll
that
just end
really
with
was
on
the
this one
catalyst
here.
for us because here we have a major U.S. city that's out of service, out of critical electric service, and all the things that critical electric service provides. And they were out for up to 3 weeks. And the CEO of the utility basically says, hey, we're out there doing our very best. You know, our linemen are putting life and limb at risk. God bless our linemen. They did a great job. But they rebuilt the system the exact same way as it came down, just like they did after Katrina. And at some point in time, you got to say, we got to do this a little bit differently. And so that's what we're starting to propose today.
Absolutely, Mike. And it's got to be different. Doing the same thing over and over again is certainly a definition we're all familiar with. And I'll just, on this one here, I'm going to just wrap up. And then remember in December of last year, which is just a few months ago, we had that freakish outbreak of tornadoes across 5 states. And then something I had never seen before was those derecho winds that hit, you know, right after those tornadoes that impacted the area between Colorado and Michigan. And the big takeaway really is these things are real. They're huge. They're devastating. They're getting worse, and they're increasing. That is the takeaway from there. You know, so some recent things that have occurred since we wrote the article that really lend credence into this whole issue that we've got to take action now and we've got to do something is this first one here is utility surveys are indicating that they are confirming that this issue has risen to the top of their charts, and loss of infrastructure for these extreme and storms have to be addressed. And as you noted, Mike, they have to be done differently. Can't just repeat for a lot of reasons, which we'll go into. I think that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, has addressed this, and I think it's notable that they have moved extreme natural events into their highest risk and challenges category. So think about this. NERC is really about reliability, and we'll touch on this more, and they are moving this particular issue, resiliency, into their top highest level. And as we kind of move on through some of this recent news, you know, FERC put together this FERC State Transmission Task Force on how to get transmission built. And they have addressed some thoughts here. And they identified resiliency as a possible fourth driver for justifying and building transmission, and had recognition that when you evaluate the value of doing these types of projects, that you need to evaluate these things over a longer time frame, because you're not going to necessarily see a return on value or break even in a 7 to 15 year time frame. It could be much longer. Very, very important. Then out on the East Coast here, on Public Service Enterprise out of New Jersey, they are looking to spend up to $16 billion over the next 5 years to focus on improvements in resiliency. And they have noted here, you know, a few different drivers. And one of the points that we also try to make is, and it's not just for where we are today, that as the U.S. and the world goes to greater electrification, there will be more reliance on the grid. And the grid has to be protected better than it is today. I think it's interesting to note here in Memphis that the mayor is proposing to sell the municipal utility and then use the proceeds to underground their power line so that they are able to avoid wide-scale power outages that they have been exposed to from the storms over the last decade. And they've noted that they've increased in the last few years for them. And Whether this actually occurs or not, don't know, but just the fact that that is what they are looking at, I think is notable. And then under that event that hit Texas and the monumental cost that we were talking about, I think it is interesting, is the total financial fallout from last year's winter storm in Texas, from that winter storm Uri, is they are estimated between $80 and $130 billion. I don't know about you, Mike. That's a lot of money. A lot of infrastructure could have been built with this kind of investment. And I think it's really important to note that that number includes the total cost of all direct and indirect costs. And I'll point out that includes the community economic opportunities. So you touched on that, Mike, in your comments, and we believe that that needs to be incorporated as people work with their communities and their regulators.
Yeah, Rob, there's so much to say about this particular slide. I don't think that planners and engineers are looking at the total cost of the asset over the life of the asset. So you look at things like that where you have to come back and replace and replace and replace. And what is the total cost of that? What is the cost to the community? What's the cost when you don't have critical infrastructure like fire and police and communications and water and wastewater and such? And I don't think we as an industry have done a good job of quantifying that. And you could go back to that Texas situation and you might say, well, gee, a lot of that $80 to $130 billion, was that really the responsibility of the grid, or was that, loss of generation? But I know you know some of the background on that too. There were grid-related things that did contribute to how we shed load on the grid, how we prioritized shedding load, and what critical infrastructure that impacted that might have kept the whole thing from cascading in the state of Texas. So fascinating topic, and that is real money that we're talking about. And you're going to talk about PG&E, and they're going to spend a lot of money because they were forced into bankruptcy. And why would they go back and do the same thing the way they've always done it?
Yeah. So in this particular case, now, remember, they've had so many wildfires over the last few years, you can get lost in which ones we're talking about. But in this particular case, they, being PG&E, paid out over $25 billion to resolve the loss of 100 lives and the destruction that occurred from the wildfires that were caused by power lines. And I hate to say that, since then there's been more. So this is not the end. And, they, being PG&E, have recognized that they can't just keep doing this. And they are already made the decision to move towards undergrounding much of their far-flung lower voltage transmission lines and improving their right-of-ways. But again, if you just take a look at this $25 billion and you add in the other billions of dollars, if they would have had foresight on this, they could have been using this to accomplish real changes instead of this approach of destroying towns or losing towns, destroying economies, and the loss of life that is associated with it.
So 2 comments on that, Rob. So Patty Poppe, their CEO, came out last summer and basically said they're going to underground 10% of their transmission and distribution system, and they're going to spend $15 to $30 billion to do that, just that 10%. And she says we can't afford not to do that. One of the other alternatives that they have at PG&E is microgrids. But the reason they can't build, and we as an industry don't build microgrids as they're currently defined, Rob, is because we can't cite the generation. We can't cite the on-site generation, especially in California. Okay, I'm going to have a diesel generator there with a 30-day supply of diesel fuel sitting there for weeks, months, years at a time before it ever has to operate in the microgrid mode, and they can't get that permitted. So we're going to propose that instead of putting that kind of on-site generation in places, that we're going to run a dedicated hardened feeder, whether overhead or underground, to that microgrid as we start to define what a new microgrid might look like.
Absolutely. And again, a little foreshadowing here. The approach that at PG&E is using is a very straightforward reliability approach. And if they were to flip that and say we are going to take a resiliency approach, they may come up with different solutions. And if they're given other tools, you touched on it with the planning. Planners can only do as good a job with the tools that they're given. Maybe planners need to be given different tools, different information to come up with different solutions, which is what we're proposing, and taking a look at how you can use microgrids to achieve this. Moving on, here is one consultant that has estimated utilities need to spend an additional $500 billion over what they're already spending to address increased risk and prepare the grid for a changing environment. And the consultant notes that many utilities are just beginning this journey. And I think that's where we are. I think we can come up with examples across the U.S. where some utilities have gone down this path already. And some are into this for 10 to 20 years, and some possibly longer. But many have not. And this is where we are pushing that this needs to be rethought because of the order of magnitude of investment that's going to be done, the criticalness of getting this right, and the impacts to people and the impacts to communities. And let me finish off with this background information with this particular item. And I think most people would be surprised that there might be a reference or report to Deloitte on this subject. But they've done an interesting job of putting this together, and they are advocating for increased resiliency through more flexibility and grid hardening. And of particular note, they indicate that resiliency improvements can be a no-regret investment. And, that's hard to come by in some cases. But they've tied it also to decarbonization. That as part of this, they indicate that the need to work with regulators, customers to develop the funding. You just touched on that. I've been, touching on this here. And this is going to be a critical change in how planning, is done, should be done. In the report, in the grid hardening, they noticed that substations need to be reinforced, need to have pole replacement. They need to have asset elevation. I like that part. We always talk about asset undergrounding, which they touch on, but they also use that term asset elevation. Not one I normally use, but it's raising elements of poles or structures for fires, but also substations for flooding. So, with that, let's kind of move on into just a little bit about resiliency. All of the industry organizations have a definition for resiliency, and I might add that they're all very good. They're all very succinct and precise. And you and I are fully in alignment with that. But in essence, what we are talking about is, as noted here, that resiliency is the ability to reduce the magnitude and duration of extreme disruptive events through prevention and preparedness, response, and recovery. And, pretty much means that you don't have to protect everything from every event. In fact, we would advocate that you can't do that. And so that's why you need to have a lot more surgical approaches in how you're doing this. And ultimately, the way we're proposing microgrids, this is one of those ways of doing it.
And Rob, I'll just add too,
yeah.
With reliability, we have all sorts of matrices where we can track reliability, right? But with resiliency, we haven't really, as an industry, come up with metrics on how do I know if I'm a resilient system. So Dominion's done some work with strategic undergrounding, and they've come up with total time of line restoration, which is pretty good. It's, a couple of days, less that the governor's calling the CEO to ask when his constituents are going to get back in service. But that's something I think that as an industry we can work on in the future. And I will note, Rob, too, with your planning background, you have got both the engineering design and operations and maintenance background, but you have background as a planner as well. So you can really speak with a lot of credibility on this, I think.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out, we do here, but when you look at the difference between reliability and resiliency, and I'm going to touch on that more in a different light, but think about this, that standards apply to reliability, and they, and they're needed and it's appropriate, and regulators focus on standards. So all the focus is on that portion of the spectrum, and I would advocate that there is a gap in understanding how much resiliency there should be and how much investment there should be allocated for resiliency. And Mike, I know that every utility is going to be challenged. They never can get the money they want for each of the proposals that they've got going on, and it is hard for someone to advocate within a utility for we need to allocate money for resiliency for something that may never happen, while we're asking for money for these types of things we know are going to happen. And
right.
This is that part of the conundrum, that this is where more is needed. And this is where the thought process has to be different and the tools have to be different. And what is included in the planning process needs to be different. So we have this particular slide, this graphic in the article, and I think it's a good one. I think it helps in communicating what is the difference between a reliability event and a resiliency event. And, there's no bright line. And it's gray, it's a transitional, we put it on here under the continuum change. And, what one utility on the East Coast does for an event that might be a hurricane is going to be different from a West Coast that looks at wildfires, and they could fall differently. But there is that difference that some events are. I would really have the big takeaway is understanding that this was developed by the Transmission Resiliency Maturity Model, or TRIM, and that was a development. If I didn't say model, I really meant to say maturity model. And it was a collaboration between NATF and U.S. Department of Energy, EPRI, the Pacific Northwest National Labs. And the goal of TRIM is to have each utility move from a low state of resiliency maturity to a high level of resiliency maturity over time, so they are better prepared for the upcoming severe and extreme events that are going to occur. And there's a lot more to talk about this, but we just don't have time. I hope every utility really looks at what is out there on this. So now I think we're going to move into that term that you started us off with, Mike, and that was that critical infrastructure for critical times. And this is what we're talking about, is critical infrastructure being the way in which we're proposing microgrids to be tied in for resiliency and for those critical times. People want air conditioners on the hottest days of the year, not the coldest days of the year. People want the electricity to work when things are much more challenging and you don't need it on the easy days. And that's certainly what we need at critical times. Loss of electricity over extended periods of time is very, very different than a loss of 2 hours or 4 hours or half a day. Kind of repeating a little bit, these severe storms are increasing. And when they are prolonged an extended period of time with a loss of electricity, we know that lives are lost. I'm going to say this politically correct. Security could be compromised in those areas where you have extended outages or loss of grid. Emergency responders are disrupted. Communities are fractured. There's economic devastation, and the ability to respond and rebuild is extended. Very, very important that there are so many other parties that get impacted beyond just utilities trying to do their work and responding to these major events, that many planners and operators don't necessarily see because they're protected from it somewhat. We advocate that the time to act is now. I noted that these types of improvements take a long time. I don't care who you are. Nobody can put together a resiliency project and get it done in 5 years. You can't put a 5-year plan together. These types of things are going to take 10, 15, 20, and maybe longer, and that's okay. But if you start now and you have this long-term approach, you'll ultimately be building your resiliency maturity over time and getting better and better at it.
Rob, and I'll comment to that end. At Florida Power and Light, they did a pilot on undergrounding, strategic undergrounding of a lot of their distribution laterals, and they've concluded now with regulatory approval that they're going to do their program instead of over 30 years. Now they're going to accelerate it to over 20 years. So to your point, these are big initiatives. Again, on the other coast, Pacific Gas and Electric says we're going to underground 10% of our T&D system. And, the big question is, well, what 10% will that be? And that's a great opportunity for planners and engineers to add a lot of value as to defining what 10% that's going to be. But these are, to your point, multi-year, long-term efforts. We're just not going to change. For example, at Southern Cal Edison, they've got a little bit of a different service territory than PG&E, but they're doing some things with regard to wildfires, like covered conductors and emerging technologies and such, that and not as much strategic undergrounding, because they have to have an immediate impact. They can't wait 5 or 10 years to solve this wildfire situation and continue to have their public safety power shutoffs.
Yeah. Mike, excellent point, because every region and every utility is likely to have different issues to deal with. And it's going to have to be unique approaches, and it has to be done by them. No one can step in and give you an answer. So, Mike, the next question might be is so what's the answer? and we would say, certainly from a global perspective, that every utility needs to prepare for these high-impact, low-frequency events. Some are, not everybody is, and not everybody is to these different extreme events. And every utility needs to benchmark their current resiliency level and develop a plan on how they're going to change it. Now, one of the things that we are proposing is what was described here as secure and functional and prepared for rapid restoration as compared to standard construction. Standards are applied. Each utility has their own set of standards, and there's a really good reason for having standards, and and it's the right thing to be doing. And it ensures that there's consistent reliability across their region, whatever that might be. And what we are proposing is that in utilities planning for the health events, that they should be looking at what type of health events are we going to have, or what are we exposed to. And again, just an extreme contrast that somebody on the Gulf Coast might be, planning for hurricanes, and somebody in the desert Southwest is certainly not planning for a hurricane. But they need to take a look at, okay, when it hits, what is going to be standing? And that's what we're saying is a secure and functional, is that part of the system needs to look at making certain that no matter what that event is, it doesn't get lost. And then there's this other smaller portion, which, as you were pointing out, Mike, with PG&E and others, that it is prepared for rapid restoration. So it is set up so that it can be rapidly restored as compared to standard construction. And those two elements comprise just a small portion of the entire system, but it all lends into ensuring that there is continuity of service to critical infrastructure. And as I was describing this, we could certainly go into more detail if there's interest in the Q&A, is to optimize the principles of prevent, respond, and recover, which pretty much every utility does for their emergency response, into the entire chain of planning, design, construction, and operations, so that they can achieve a much more resilient grid. So I kind of think, so you go through that, and as you buy into what we're saying, the next question again might be, so how do you do that? Okay, this all sounds great, but how do you actually make this happen? And this is where, we are proposing a redefined microgrid. And, we are proposing a solution as part of the overall approach to what a redefined microgrid is, or how you approach this entire approach. And, so instead of a microgrid being what it is today, which is an autonomous section of the grid that is, designed to be able to operate separately from the main grid, to improve reliability, to one in which, Mike, you and I envision that it is to achieve high levels of resiliency and ensure that there is this continuity of electric service through the steps we've been talking about, so that critical infrastructure has the electric feeds, and part of that, as we'll talk a little bit more, is to other areas that are designated as critical. And
well, one of the challenges with microgrids, Rob, is that we simply don't build them. We talk about them, but we simply don't build them in the industry, because at the end of the day, they don't make financial and or environmental sense. You can't cite, on-site generation in a lot of places for microgrids, and the cost of maintaining that for long periods of time is just very, very high. So utilities want to build a microgrid. We understand the concept of a microgrid. We understand how it benefits resiliency and the ability to withstand a high-impact, low-frequency event, but we don't build them. So we're saying, okay, we're going to tweak, or we're going to change the definition, and you're getting ready to talk about how that definition is going to change. We're going to provide electricity. Critical infrastructure is going to get electricity at critical times via a microgrid with this reimagined microgrid concept that you're going to talk about next, Rob.
Yeah, and Mike, if you try to fund a current microgrid on a reliability basis, it just has not been panning out. But if you are proposing a microgrid to serve the purpose of resiliency, and we've been talking about the types of billions and billions or hundreds of billions that that are going to be spent, that helps fund and justify how you would attack this. And I think that's one thing I really hope everyone starts thinking about more and more, is how you are justifying in what it's accomplishing. Yeah, so in a reimagined microgrid, it stays connected to the grid at select and hardened and protected points. So it doesn't break off and operate autonomously. It stays connected. It provides continuity of service to critical infrastructure. And, those are the 16 areas of critical infrastructure that electricity provides to all the other areas of critical infrastructure, and to designated community areas. So it's not just for the financial centers. It's not just for transportation. This needs to be done in harmony with the community, so that there is areas to where people can get service. And, the point that we try to make in the article is, if people know there is electricity, they know they have security, and they can just be patient, and they're not going to be left stranded, it's going to work. If you don't have
Rob,
that, yeah.
Yeah, I want to point out this particular picture on this slide as well, because here's a big transmission corridor, right? And all of these circuits that are going out of this corridor, if a hurricane comes through there, it takes out the whole corridor. There's no corridor security to speak of at all. In my opinion, one of those circuits ought to be put underground, because now you're protecting that corridor with a little bit of added resiliency. I'm sure those poles are designed for 150 miles an hour, but at the end of the day, if that corridor goes out, in the next Cat 5, everything goes out.
Yeah, Mike. Every utility has common corridors, and not everything. For example, we advocate that you need to do some undergrounding. Not everything has to be underground, but certainly probably need to have at least one. And that gets into that to ensure, through each individual utility's plan on how they strategically do this, they ensure that happens. And so your takeaway on this, just as you described, a basic, small, yet greatly diminished grid would remain intact even after a severe and extreme event. So, in a calm corridor like that, you can make it to withstand as much wind as you want. But if you get debris in those lines, let's say a boat gets thrown into it, it doesn't matter. It's still going to take them all out. So, we touched on these other points, and so I think and I hope that this point of what needs to be done is coming across. And so when we look at this functionality, I really want to emphasize that there needs to be a complete chain from the resources that are part of this to the load that needs to be addressed. So, going in there and hardening one substation, hardening one transmission line doesn't get the job done. It needs to be evaluated for ensuring the resource that is going to feed that critical infrastructure and the transmission and the substation and the distribution feeders are all part of that overall plan. And, certainly, undergrounding, I think, is going to be a overall key element. Elevating or raising of stations where there's flooding is likely to be included. Hardening, it's hard to imagine that there won't be a lot of hardening going on. And they must be coordinated with community involvement so they know what is going to be surviving in the event of a extreme or severe storm. And Mike, we kind of mentioned this difference between reliability and resiliency. And I think that one thing another good takeaway here is that investments in resiliency will certainly help improve reliability. But conversely, it's not necessarily true. And so when you do these resiliency improvements, you ultimately have a system that functions better and hopefully provides some additional operational flexibility as well. And then ending up here is in these cost, benefits, and value. We touched on the type of dollars that are out there. And again, when you talk about those utilities that serve large areas, everything is in the billions here. And the full life costs have to be evaluated. And, it's important because if you have something fall down and you replace it like for like, and then maybe 10 or 15 years later, you're doing that again, you need to look at not just the full life of the material and the labor, but you got to look at the impacts that are out there, and the operational cost and the additional cost of all the outages impacted, or all those impacted by those outages. And then we get a long list here of the other elements that I know are not included. And again, it'd be great to see if there's utility that includes all these elements. I've done things with insurance companies, and I hated to have to tell people, your impact to your car, your house, and other things. But that was an act of God, and you or your insurance have to cover all those costs, and not the utility. And I think when utilities are able to work with community leaders and with regulators and looking at what is this trade-off, what are these approaches, and how big is this impact to the community at wide, I think that maybe there can be some breakthroughs in understanding on getting a plan that is funded to address resiliency separately, and so that there can be this focus on doing it, as we have mentioned, over this long period of time. And that's going to be very, very important. And so as we wrap this up, and then we can get to Q&A, we've talked about, a bit about service and critical times. when we start talking outages that last days and weeks, we're talking more than just electricity and the cost of the crews and the materials that are expedited to address this issue. It is much, much larger. We need to see the industry change so that there is a well-planned and designed electric system for resiliency. Move beyond just reliability. It's real, it's happening, and it's significant. We are offering a change in paradigm to how a microgrid can serve this area of providing this continuity of service so that, one, communities are protected, and there can be an approach to where resiliency can be achieved so that these communities can respond faster. I mean, when you and I looked at how long it took New Orleans to get going again, it was frustrating. And knowing that if there had been just the basic levels of start, and if the system had been set up to be able to be repaired and restored faster, it would have made all the difference in the world. And, we're seeing the economic impacts from something like Texas. Those are astronomical numbers that we can't even really fathom sometimes. And then lastly, we got to start now. You're thinking here it is 2022, and you've got 10, 15, 20, 25 years to get to these higher levels of resiliency. You can't wait, for 2030 to come around. In this entire time frame, you have it's fragile, and the risk levels are becoming too much, and there needs to be this change, and we are offering a approach that changes how this can be done. And Mike, so with that, let's kind of move on and go into Q&A.
Well, Rob, we got a lot of great questions here from utilities and regulators and contractors and consultants. So we'll dive right in. If you got additional questions, go ahead and ask them. I'm going to ask one. There's a couple questions in this. Define what you mean by hardening, if you would, Rob. When you talk about when you talk about hardening, what does that really mean? And some people think that an underground system takes longer to repair than an overhead system. Maybe you can comment on that as well.
Yeah, certainly. Hardening is going to be, unique to each region. And I would say from a general perspective, hardening means you have a circuit. If you're saying that this is one which is secure and functional, it has to be designed. So if you're saying it's secure and functional for a hurricane, that you have gone through the analysis of saying that as a hurricane, wind, flood, debris come through, I'm not going to lose it. So that in many cases drives to an underground solution. In other cases, if it tends to be more remote, let's say you have a more rural environment, a hardened system could be moving from structures that are wood to steel. It could be increasing the distances between phases. It could be saying that I need to protect this against these much higher winds and debris. And so it really requires a custom approach. So it's really hard to be general on that. Underground systems really perform well. I think people would be surprised at how well they really perform. Think about islands, right? They're served off of underground cables, and they perform well over very long periods of time. And one of the things that they're most exposed to are anchors if they're not buried deep enough or had not been buried at all. So these types of things can be done. And so I want to go back to the other element, Mike, that I had. So one part of the system needs to be put together so that in the event that I expose it to, I don't lose it. And then the other category is, okay, I can't spend all my money in one little thing. On other elements, whether it's stations, distribution feeders, or transmission lines, it's designed and built for rapid restoration. So I know that in the event that it has an impact, I lose conductor or something else, it doesn't take out everything. It doesn't knock it over, and I have cascading for miles. It's very, very limited, and I set it up to be rebuilt. There we go.
Yeah, let me jump to another question here. We have about 10 minutes left and lots of questions. Putting wires underground will certainly provide resiliency. Are you proposing centralized generation or localized generation? So let's clarify. We're not talking about on-site generation. We're talking about a dedicated, hardened feeder or transmission line that is going to provide the energy along with demand-side resources, along with DER, to the defined geographic area of the microgrid. Is that an accurate statement, Rob?
Yeah, it is, Mike, and I apologize to everybody that I didn't touch on that a little bit more. Absolutely.
Okay. Talk about communications and how communications infrastructure needs to be part of integrated into this microgrid concept.
Mike, could you repeat that for me?
Yeah. How does communication need to be integrated into the microgrid? In other words, you're going to have some kind of you got a hardened, robust electric system. You're going to have a communication system that's going to support the links to system control. How does that work? You thought about that at all?
Yeah, that's a terrific question because we did not touch on that in the article at all. And yeah, so it's going to come through that layering effect of different communication devices, and done in depth and layering. In some cases, if you're undergrounding and having fiber protected, that's a great way. But there's also some wireless opportunities out there. In fact, it's changing quite a bit. And so, we're not proposing a specific approach, but it absolutely needs to be incorporated, and it has to be done in a way that is consistent with what a utility has or what can be secured in an area. But whoever asked that question are absolutely correct.
No, that's a great question. Here's a couple of questions into one. Where does the money come from for resiliency planning and implementation? And are public utility regulators encouraging rate-based allowance to invest in T&D infrastructure for resiliency specifically? What's your sense of that? I sense that is starting to happen. I think regulators are starting to hear it. I think the C-suite's starting to hear about underground, well, let's say just resiliency in general. But what's your sense of it, Rob?
Yeah, one is I do believe that there has to be a more dedicated, focused revenue stream or funding for it. It's just too easy to get lost. And we all know that all the urgency that utilities have on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis take high priority. There are many out there. So one is that it's got to be dedicated. For anything to be done over 10, 15, 20, 25 years requires much more than what we're doing today. And I do believe regulators from federal to state to local are understanding this. And I think if there are plans that incorporate them and communities in addressing the value, I want to go back to that because we did touch on that part, the value of what it does for communities. If it's done in conjunction with them, I think that can help get us through that particular hurdle or high bar.
Okay, here's a great question. This is a challenging question. It seems to me that better integration of operating distributed generation is being ignored in this discussion. The cost of distributed generation is dropping. The cost of T&D gets too high, and we may end up with stranded investment. So I'll just comment, Rob. I don't think we're not talking about DG and distributed energy resources. That's definitely a component of it. Rooftop solar, storage, mobile electric vehicles as mobile storage, strong demand side program. But at the end of the day, would you agree that that is not sufficient to provide even the minimal levels of load to these the critical infrastructure?
Yeah, Mike, again, I'll apologize to this particular questioner and that it's in the article. We do say it's included and should be included, but that alone doesn't ensure where we are. But absolutely, we would want to include that in the overall response. Just use quickly New Orleans as an example. They had a generator that they couldn't use because they couldn't connect it to the outside grid and have it sync. They may have had some local generation there, but those two things together would have provided the continuity of service. But that alone wouldn't have allowed necessarily for the type of microgrid that we're proposing to be met. And I'll leave it at that because it requires a lot more discussion.
Okay, so just to be clear, and this is relative to a question here, and we've just got a couple of minutes left, but we're talking about redefining or reimagining a microgrid that instead of having on-site generation now has a dedicated feeder that's highly resilient that will withstand a high-impact, low-frequency event, whether that's a hardened overhead line or a dedicated underground line. Is that a fair assessment, Rob?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Here's another question, and I think that we'll jump to our conclusions here. How is the proposed definition of microgrid scoped in terms of size and boundaries by load, number of customers, number of high-priority customers, geopolitical areas that have historically had frequency of outages, or by another factor? Great question.
Yeah, great insight there, and it almost answers the question. Is that we're proposing that ultimately for larger metro areas that you're going to have multiple microgrids in there. It wouldn't just be one, and they may not even be connected, but they would be planned and developed such that each area of a large metro area is protected to the right level of resiliency. And so each region is going to have some different approaches based upon their urban density and their rural densities. That is going to take a lot of strategizing to meet what needs to be done. And I think it still goes back to the planners need to think of this differently, and it's going to have to involve communities. That's the state, the county, city levels, depending upon the state that you're in, on how their emergency responses are set up and prepared and what makes sense for that region.
Rob, we've had some great questions. This white paper and the article from T&D World Magazine will be available at the Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative website. That's pdi2.org. And I'll just say, Rob, why don't you give us some of your concluding thoughts as you sign off and say goodbye to our audience today?
Yeah. From my experience, and I've had a few bad ones, not necessarily ones that PG&E or some on the Gulf or East Coast have had. And going through these types of events are terrible. We, as an industry, need to have a different approach to what we're doing. We can't keep doing what we've done for the last 20 and 30 years over the next 20, 30 years. We know that what our challenges are going to be will be bigger and badder than what we've had in the past. So something needs to be done differently. And we are proposing an approach that changes the focus from reliability into the resiliency, because I really believe communities need to know that they are protected, especially as we become more and more reliant on electrification of the grid and in our society. We need to act. We need to take action now. We know a lot of money is going to be spent, Mike, and let's spend it in the right way and hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls we've had over the last 20 years.
Rob, that's really well said. So, I really appreciate your friendship and your leadership in the industry. I think this paper is extremely timely. Really appreciate T&D World Magazine for putting that paper into an article format in the February issue, and doing this webinar today. Appreciate the Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative for sponsoring this webinar. I think it's a great topic. You can find a lot of resources at pdi2.org. And with that, I bid the audience a farewell. Thank you very much. Be safe out there. Jeff, handing it back to you for any conclusions, but thanks a lot and have a great day.
Thank you, Mike and Robert. Like he already said, on behalf of T&D World, I'd like to thank Robert Konzioka and Mike Beeler for presenting, and the Power Delivery Intelligence Initiative for sponsoring today's event, and of course all of you for joining. I want you to have a great rest of your day, and stay tuned to T&D World Online, where we'll have lots of microgrid coverage for you if you're interested in that. Thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your week.